Pablo stood in front of the animal shelter, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, hesitating at the entrance. The death of his wife had left an emptiness in his home that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. His friends had suggested getting a dog or a cat, but Pablo wasn't sure he was ready for that level of commitment. "Just look around," Wilson, the shelter manager, had told him over the phone. "Sometimes the right companion finds you." The shelter was quieter than Pablo expected. A few dogs barked in the distance, but the atmosphere was surprisingly peaceful. Wilson greeted him with a warm smile and began showing him around. "We have some wonderful dogs and cats that need homes," Wilson said, leading Pablo through the corridors. "They're all vaccinated and ready for adoption." Pablo nodded politely, but none of the animals sparked that connection he was hoping to feel. As they reached the end of the tour, strange sounds caught his attention, a mixture of whistles and scratchy vocals coming from a small room off to the side. "What's that?" Pablo asked, pointing toward the sound. Wilson's expression changed slightly. "Oh, that's just Quico. He's been here longer than any other animal." Intrigued, Pablo walked toward the room. Inside, in a large cage, sat the most peculiar-looking parrot he had ever seen. The bird's feathers were patchy, with bare spots visible on its chest and wings. One eye was slightly clouded, and it held its head at an odd angle. "Most people don't even want to look at him," Wilson explained, his voice softening. "He was rescued from a terrible situation. The previous owner—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Quico has some special needs. He can't fly properly due to his injured wing, and his vision is impaired. We've had him for years, but nobody wants to adopt him." Pablo stepped closer to the cage. The parrot stopped its whistling and turned its head, fixing its good eye on Pablo with an intensity that made him catch his breath. "Hello," Pablo said softly. To his surprise, the parrot responded with a clear, gentle voice. "Hello, friend." Something in the way the bird said those words touched Pablo deeply. Despite its appearances, there was an undeniable intelligence and gentleness in its gaze. "Why hasn't anyone adopted him?" Pablo asked, unable to look away from the parrot. Wilson sighed. "People come here wanting perfect pets. They see Quico's injuries, his appearance, and they move on. Plus, he doesn't speak much, just a few words here and there. Most people wanting parrots expect them to be more entertaining." Pablo watched as Quico preened his remaining feathers, maintaining dignity despite his circumstances. In that moment, Pablo saw something of himself in this abandoned creature, something about surviving loss and still carrying on. "I'll take him," Pablo said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Wilson's eyebrows shot up. "Are you sure? He requires special care and he might never be like a normal parrot." Pablo nodded, feeling more sure with each passing moment. "Sometimes the most meaningful relationships come from unexpected places," he said, remembering something his wife used to say. As Wilson went to get the adoption papers, Pablo stayed with Quico. The parrot had stopped preening and was watching him with that same intense gaze. "Friend?" Quico said again, softer this time, almost like a question. "Yes," Pablo replied, feeling a smile form on his face for the first time in months. "Friends." What Pablo didn't know as he signed the adoption papers was that this damaged, unwanted parrot would soon change his life in ways he could never imagine. But that revelation would have to wait, as some secrets take time to reveal themselves. The drive home with Quico was silent, except for the occasional rustle of feathers in the carrier. Pablo kept glancing in his rearview mirror, checking on his new companion. The parrot remained still, watching the world pass by through the carrier's small openings with his good eye. Pablo's house sat at the end of a quiet street, a modest two-story building that had grown too large for just one person. As he carried Quico inside, memories of happier times seemed to echo through the empty rooms. But today, something felt different. The house didn't feel quite as empty. "Well, this is home," Pablo said, setting the carrier down in the living room. He had spent the previous day preparing a space for Quico, following Wilson's detailed instructions. A large cage stood in the corner, equipped with various perches at different heights to accommodate Quico's injured wing. Fresh water, food and toys waited inside. Opening the carrier door, Pablo stepped back, giving Quico time to emerge on his own. The parrot took his time, first extending his neck to survey his new surroundings, then carefully making his way out. His movements were deliberate, compensating for his disabilities with careful precision. "It's all yours," Pablo encouraged, watching as Quico studied the cage. "Cy Wilson said you might take some time to adjust." The parrot turned his head, fixing Pablo with that penetrating gaze again. "Friend," he said. But this time there was something different in his tone, something that made Pablo feel as if the word carried more weight than a simple mimicry. The first few days were challenging. Quico was hesitant to leave his cage, preferring to watch Pablo from his highest perch. He ate little, and only when Pablo wasn't in the room. At night, Pablo would hear soft whistles and occasional words he couldn't quite make out. Hugo, Pablo's neighbor, stopped by to meet the new addition. "A parrot?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. "I thought you were going to get a dog." "Sometimes life has other plans," Pablo replied, watching as Quico retreated to the back of his cage at the sight of the visitor. "Well, he's certainly unique," Hugo said diplomatically, eyeing the parrot's patchy feathers and clouded eye. "But are you sure this is what you need right now? Taking care of a disabled bird seems like a lot of responsibility." Pablo felt a surge of protectiveness. "We're figuring it out together," he said firmly, ending the conversation. That night, after Hugo left, Pablo noticed Quico seemed more agitated than usual. The parrot paced his perch, making soft, distressed sounds. Following his instincts, Pablo pulled up a chair near the cage and began to talk softly. "You know, I understand being afraid," he said, not sure if Quico was even listening. "When Maria passed away, I didn't want to leave the house either. Everything seemed too big, too loud, too different." He paused, surprised by how easily the words came. "But eventually, you have to trust again." Quico stopped pacing, turning to face Pablo. In the dim evening light, his damaged eye caught the lamp's glow, giving him an almost otherworldly appearance. "Trust," Quico repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trust, friend." Over the next few weeks, small changes began to occur. Quico started eating while Pablo was in the room, though he still watched him carefully. He would venture out onto the lower perches more often, and his whistles became more frequent and varied. Pablo developed a routine. Every morning, he would clean Quico's cage and replace his food and water while talking about his plans for the day. In the evening, he would sit near the cage and read aloud from whatever book he was currently enjoying. Quico seemed to particularly enjoy the sound of Pablo's voice, often tilting his head and making soft chirping sounds during the reading sessions. One evening, as Pablo was reading from his favorite novel, something extraordinary happened. He reached a dialogue passage, and as he read the character's line, "I don't understand," Quico suddenly spoke. "But you will." Pablo froze, the book nearly slipping from his hands. Those weren't words he had heard Quico say before, and they seemed to fit perfectly with the story's context. He looked at the parrot, who was watching him with that intense, one-eyed gaze. "Quico," Pablo said carefully, "did you just—" But the parrot had already turned away, beginning his evening preening routine as if nothing unusual had occurred. Pablo sat there for a long time, wondering if he had imagined it, yet something told him he hadn't. There was more to this damaged, unwanted parrot than anyone had realized. That night, Pablo lay awake in bed, thinking about Quico's mysterious response. He remembered Wilson's words about the parrot not speaking much, just a few words here and there. But what if there was a reason Quico chose not to speak? What if, like his physical injuries, there were emotional wounds that ran deeper than anyone knew? As Pablo finally drifted off to sleep, he could hear Quico's soft whistles from downstairs. They seemed different somehow, almost like a melody. In his half-conscious state, Pablo could have sworn it sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of the mysteries surrounding his unusual new companion. The next morning brought another surprise. As Pablo prepared his coffee, a sound caught his attention, the distinct noise of Quico's cage door opening. He turned to find the parrot had managed to figure out the latch mechanism, something Wilson had said he'd never shown interest in before. "Clever boy," Pablo murmured, watching as Quico navigated his way out of the cage. The parrot's movements, though still hampered by his injuries, seemed more confident than before. Quico made his way to the edge of his cage, then looked at Pablo expectantly. "Friend," he said, and then added something that made Pablo's coffee cup freeze halfway to his mouth. "Breakfast time." It wasn't just the words themselves that startled Pablo. It was the inflection, the timing, the way they were strung together. This wasn't random mimicry. This was communication. Pablo's mind raced with questions. How much did Quico really understand? What had happened in his past? And why did he choose now to reveal these abilities? As he watched the parrot carefully making his way down to his food bowl, Pablo couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. But he would soon learn that some mysteries unfold in their own time. And Quico's true story was far more remarkable than he could have imagined. The morning started like any other, with Pablo preparing breakfast while Quico watched from his now open cage. But today would prove to be anything but ordinary. As Pablo placed fresh fruit in Quico's bowl, he noticed something unusual about the parrot's behavior. Instead of eating immediately as he normally did, Quico was fixated on the morning newspaper Pablo had brought in. The parrot's good eye was focused intently on the front page. "What is it, buddy?" Pablo asked, following Quico's gaze. The headline was about a local business owner's unexpected death. Nothing particularly striking about it, yet Quico seemed transfixed. Suddenly, the parrot spoke with startling clarity. "Not accident. Murder." Pablo nearly dropped the coffee pot he was holding. "What did you say?" But Quico had already turned his attention to his breakfast, pecking at the fresh fruit as if nothing had happened. Pablo stood there, frozen, trying to process what he'd just heard. It wasn't just the words themselves that disturbed him. It was the deliberate way they'd been spoken, with purpose and meaning. Later that day, while cleaning around Quico's cage, Pablo found something tucked behind the newspaper lining, a small weathered business card. The text was faded, but he could make out a name: Elias Montgomery, private investigator. "Quico," Pablo said carefully, holding up the card. "Where did this come from?" The parrot stopped preening and fixed Pablo with that intense, one-eyed stare. "Home," he said softly. "Old home." Pablo's mind raced. Wilson had never mentioned anything about Quico living with a private investigator. In fact, he realized he knew very little about the parrot's life before the shelter. When he'd asked, Wilson had been vague, saying only that Quico had been rescued from a bad situation. That evening, Pablo decided to do some research. He searched online for Elias Montgomery and found several old newspaper articles. The investigator had been known for solving cold cases and exposing corporate fraud. But what caught Pablo's attention was the last article, dated several years ago. It reported that Montgomery had died under mysterious circumstances, his body found in his home office. The death had been ruled accidental, but there were those who questioned that conclusion. As Pablo read, Quico became increasingly agitated, pacing his perch and making soft, distressed sounds. "Our truth," he kept saying. "Truth hidden." Pablo looked at the parrot with new eyes. Could it be possible that Quico had witnessed something in his previous home? Something related to Montgomery's death? The next morning, Pablo decided to visit the shelter again. He needed to know more about Quico's background. Wilson was surprised to see him. "Is everything all right with Quico?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Yes, he's doing well," Pablo assured him. I was wondering if you could tell me more about where he came from. How did he end up here?" Wilson's expression changed subtly. "Why do you ask?" "He's been saying some strange things," Pablo admitted, "and I found this." He showed Wilson the business card. The shelter manager was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he sighed and gestured for Pablo to follow him into his office. Once inside, he closed the door. "I didn't tell you everything before," Wilson began, his voice low. "Quico was brought here by a woman named Zara. She was Elias Montgomery's housekeeper. After his death, she was worried about what might happen to the parrot." "Why was she worried?" Wilson hesitated. She said there were people asking questions about the bird. People who seemed more interested in what Quico might have seen or heard than in his welfare. Pablo felt a chill run down his spine. What exactly happened to Montgomery? Officially, he fell down the stairs in his home office, but Zara, she believed there was more to the story. She said Quico had been acting strangely in the days leading up to Montgomery's death, trying to warn him about something. Pablo thought about Quico's reaction to the newspaper, his cryptic words, and his injuries. They happened the night Montgomery died, Wilson said quietly. Zara found him like that, injured and traumatized. She never knew exactly what happened, but she believed someone had tried to silence him. That's why she brought him here, to keep him safe. She made me promise not to tell anyone his true background. Pablo sat back, his mind reeling. Why are you telling me now? Wilson leaned forward, his expression serious. Because Quico chose you. In all the years he's been here, he's never responded to anyone the way he responds to you. And because... He glanced at the door before continuing. Because Zara contacted me recently. She said things are starting to happen again. People asking questions about old cases, about Montgomery's files, about his parrot. On the drive home, Pablo's thoughts were in turmoil. He kept thinking about Quico's injuries, about the way he rarely spoke around strangers, about his reaction to the newspaper. It all started to make a terrible kind of sense. When he walked into his house, Quico was waiting for him, perched on the edge of his cage. The parrot's good eye seemed to hold years of unspoken secrets. Friend, Quico said softly. Help find truth. Pablo looked at the damaged but dignified creature before him, understanding now that he hadn't just adopted a pet. He'd become part of something much larger. Whatever had happened in that office years ago, whatever truth Quico had been trying to protect, it wasn't over. Yes, Pablo replied, and we'll find the truth together. What he didn't know then was that their search for answers would lead them down a path more dangerous than either of them could have imagined, and that Quico's seemingly random words would soon prove to be pieces of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for far too long. That night, as Pablo prepared for bed, he heard Quico making unusual sounds from downstairs. It wasn't his normal evening whistling. It sounded more like words, but in a voice that wasn't his own. Pablo crept down the stairs, careful not to make any noise. In the darkness, he could see Quico's silhouette in his cage, illuminated only by the streetlight filtering through the window. The parrot was speaking softly but clearly. The files. Check the files. It's all there. Pablo felt his heart race. The voice Quico was using. It sounded exactly like the voice of Elias Montgomery from an old interview video he'd watched earlier that day. The parrot wasn't just mimicking random words. He was repeating conversations he'd heard years ago. As Pablo stood there in the darkness, he realized that Quico wasn't just a witness to whatever had happened in that office. He was perhaps the only one who knew the whole truth. And somehow, after all these years of silence, he had chosen Pablo to help him reveal it. But revealing the truth would prove to be far more complicated and dangerous than either of them could have anticipated. Pablo woke to the sound of breaking glass. Downstairs, Quico was screeching, not his usual soft whistles, but sharp, alarming cries that pierced the night. Pablo's heart pounded as he rushed down the stairs, nearly stumbling in the darkness. The living room window was shattered, glass scattered across the floor. A brick lay among the shards, wrapped in paper with a clear message, "Forget the past." Quico was agitated, but unharmed, fluttering awkwardly in his cage. "Danger," he kept repeating. "Danger coming." After calling the police and filing a report, Pablo sat in his kitchen, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. The officer had suggested it was probably just vandals, but Pablo knew better. Someone was sending a warning. "We need to be careful, Quico," Pablo said softly. The parrot watched him with that knowing look, his good eye reflecting the kitchen light. "Safe place," Quico responded. "Montgomery's safe place." Pablo leaned forward. "What safe place, Quico? Where?" Instead of answering directly, Quico began to whistle, not his usual random sounds, but a distinct melody. Pablo recognized it as an old lullaby, the same one he'd heard Quico humming nights before. "Numbers," Quico said suddenly. Music numbers. Pablo's mind raced. He remembered reading about Montgomery's work, how he'd been known for his unusual methods of keeping records. Could the melody be some kind of code? The next morning, Pablo called in sick to work. He spent hours researching Montgomery's old cases, looking for any connection to music. His search led him to Zara, Montgomery's former housekeeper, who still lived in town. When Pablo arrived at her modest apartment, Zara seemed unsurprised to see him. "I knew someone would come eventually," she said, inviting him in. "Wilson told me you adopted Quico." Inside, Zara's apartment was cluttered but neat, filled with books and old photographs. On one wall hung a framed sheet of music, the same lullaby Quico had been whistling. "Mr. Montgomery loved music," Zara explained, following Pablo's gaze. "He used to say it was the perfect way to hide things in plain sight, numbers in musical notes, messages in melodies." "Did he hide something important?" Pablo asked. "Something about his last case." Zara's expression darkened. "The night he died, he was excited, said he'd finally found proof of something big. He spent hours in his office with Quico, going through files and making phone calls." "What happened then?" "I left for the evening as usual. When I came back the next morning..." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "The office was a mess. Mr. Montgomery was at the bottom of the stairs, dead. Quico was injured, hiding behind a fallen bookshelf. There were papers everywhere, but his most important files were gone, and the police ruled it an accident. They said he must have fallen while carrying boxes of files, but Mr. Montgomery was careful, methodical. He wouldn't have been careless on stairs he'd climbed thousands of times." Pablo thought about the brick through his window. "Someone else was there that night, weren't they?" Zara nodded slowly. "Quico knows. He saw everything. But after that night, he stopped talking to anyone. Until now, it seems." Back home, Pablo studied the copy of the sheet music Zara had given him. Quico watched intently as Pablo hummed the melody, stopping at certain notes. "Numbers," Quico repeated. "Safe numbers." Pablo looked closer at the music. Some of the notes had been marked with tiny dots, so small they were almost invisible. When he connected them, they formed a sequence of numbers. "It's a combination," he realized. "But to what?" "Bank," Quico said clearly. "Safe bank." Pablo remembered reading that Montgomery had kept a safety deposit box at the local bank. Could the music be the key to finding whatever proof Montgomery had discovered? That night, as Pablo prepared for bed, he noticed a car parked across the street, the same one he'd seen outside Zara's apartment. Someone was watching. He was putting Quico's cover over his cage when the parrot suddenly spoke in Montgomery's voice again. "Trust no one. They'll come for the box." "Who, Quico? Who's coming?" But Quico had already retreated into silence, leaving Pablo with more questions than answers. The next morning, Pablo found another message, this time slipped under his door. "Last warning. Walk away." But Pablo couldn't walk away. Not now. He looked at Quico, who had survived so much and carried these secrets for so long. Whatever truth Montgomery had discovered, whatever had cost him his life, it was time for it to come to light. He spent the day making preparations. First, he installed security cameras around his house. Then he made copies of everything he'd discovered so far, including the sheet music with its hidden code. One copy went to Wilson at the shelter, another to a trusted friend, instructions to be opened if anything happened to him. As evening approached, Pablo noticed more unusual cars in the neighborhood. Someone was clearly watching his every move, but they hadn't acted yet, which meant they weren't sure if he'd figured out the melody's secret. "We have to be smart about this, Quico," Pablo said, closing the curtains. "We only get one chance." Quico bobbed his head, his good eye fixed on Pablo. "Careful," he said softly. "Watch shadows." That night, Pablo couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to every sound, wondering who was out there in the darkness. Quico was unusually quiet, as if he too sensed the growing tension. In the early hours of the morning, Pablo heard Quico make a soft warning sound. Moments later, there was a subtle creak from downstairs, so faint he might have missed it if he hadn't been listening so intently. Someone was in the house. Pablo moved silently to his bedroom door, his heart pounding. He had to get to Quico. But as he reached for the handle, he heard multiple sets of footsteps moving through his house. They were no longer content with warnings. They had come to silence the truth once and for all. Pablo knew he had to act fast. Everything would depend on what he did next. But he had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would change everything. Not just for him and Quico, but for everyone connected to Montgomery's last case. The truth was about to emerge from the shadows, and nothing would ever be the same. Pablo's mind raced as he heard the intruders moving through his house. He knew they would head for Quico first. The parrot was the key to everything. Thankfully, he had prepared for this possibility. Earlier that day, after seeing the suspicious cars, Pablo had moved Quico's cage to an unexpected location. Instead of its usual place in the living room, the cage now sat in a hidden alcove of his laundry room, concealed behind hanging sheets. It wasn't ideal, but it might buy them precious time. The empty cage in the living room would serve as a distraction. Pablo grabbed his phone, already dialing the police with trembling fingers. He had installed a silent alarm system just days before. It had already sent an alert the moment the intruders breached his back door. Now he just had to stay quiet and keep them away from Quico long enough for help to arrive. Downstairs he could hear them discovering the empty cage. "The bird's not here," a voice whispered harshly. "Search everything. It has to be here somewhere." Pablo moved silently through his upstairs hallway toward the back stairs, the ones that led directly to the laundry room. His feet knew every creaky board to avoid, every step that would give him away. In the darkness, he heard Quico make a soft sound, not his usual whistle, but something almost inaudible, as if the parrot understood the need for absolute silence. The intruders were moving methodically through the house, their flashlight beams sweeping across walls and furniture. Pablo could see their shadows moving below through the stair railing. 3 men, all dressed in dark clothing. Suddenly, one of them started up the main staircase. Pablo froze, then slowly retreated into the nearest room, his home office. He left the door slightly ajar, watching through the crack as a beam of light moved along the hallway. "Check everywhere," the man called softly to his companions. The old man must have hidden more than just files in that box. Find anything that looks like a code. Pablo's heart jumped. They didn't know about the music sheet, at least not yet. Whatever was in Montgomery's safety deposit box, these men still hadn't found it. A sound from outside made the intruders pause, a car driving slowly past the house. Pablo knew it would be the first police patrol, doing a subtle drive-by before setting up their positions. The security company had assured him they would handle it this way. No sirens, no flashlights, just quiet efficiency. The intruders sensed something too. Their movements became more hurried, less careful. "We need to finish this," one of them hissed. "Find the bird or kill it, but we need to go." Pablo's blood ran cold at their words, but he forced himself to stay still. The police would be in position now. All he had to do was keep Quico safe for a few more minutes. Then he heard something that made his heart stop. Quico had started to whistle, not loudly, but the sound was unmistakable. It was the lullaby, the one that held Montgomery's code. The intruders heard it too. Their flashlight beams immediately turned toward the back of the house. "The laundry room," one of them said. "It's coming from there." Pablo had to act. He couldn't let them reach Quico. Taking a deep breath, he did the only thing he could think of. He started whistling the same tune, but from his hiding place in the office. The sound made the intruders freeze. Then their lights swung toward his location. At that moment, red and blue lights suddenly filled the house, not from sirens, but from police tactical lights positioned outside every window. A voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is the police. We have the house surrounded. Come out with your hands up." What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. The intruders tried to run, but the police had indeed surrounded the house. Within minutes, all 3 men were in custody. As the police secured the scene, Pablo rushed to the laundry room. Quico was there, unharmed, watching everything with his good eye. "Safe now," Quico said softly as Pablo approached. "Like before. Safe now." Pablo gently stroked Quico's head. "Yes, you're safe. But what happened before, Quico? What did you and Montgomery find?" Instead of answering directly, Quico began to whistle the lullaby again, but this time he added words between the notes. Box, proof, pictures. One of the arrested men was already talking to the police, hoping for a deal. He revealed that they worked for someone who had been desperate to find anything Montgomery might have left behind, particularly photographs or documents that might have been stored in a safety deposit box. The box, Pablo said, looking at Quico. That's what this was all about, wasn't it? Montgomery hid something in that safety deposit box, something they never found. Quico bobbed his head. Numbers in music, safe numbers. Pablo took out the sheet music he'd hidden in his sock. The sequence of dots was still visible, forming what he now knew had to be a safety deposit box number and code. As he studied it, he noticed something else. Tiny words written in Montgomery's handwriting along the margins, so small they were almost invisible. Truth in pictures, safe in sound. Pablo looked at Quico with newfound understanding. Montgomery hadn't just hidden numbers in the music, he'd hidden the location of evidence that could expose whatever he had discovered before his death. But as Pablo would soon learn, getting to that safety deposit box would prove to be just as dangerous as the confrontation he'd just survived, because somewhere out there, someone was still desperate to keep Montgomery's last discovery buried forever. The truth was finally within reach, but the most dangerous part of their journey was still to come. As dawn broke over the house, now full of police officers documenting evidence, Pablo realized that he and Quico had passed the point of no return. The next step would require not just courage, but perfect timing, because the people behind this wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and now they knew exactly how close Pablo and Quico were to uncovering everything. As if reading his thoughts, Quico spoke softly, "Be careful, friend." Shadows still watching. Pablo nodded, knowing that the next 24 hours would either reveal the truth Montgomery died protecting or silence it forever. Part 6. The Hidden Truth. Early morning light filtered through the bank's windows as Pablo waited in line, his heart pounding. The musical code had led him here, to this moment. After the police had finished processing the crime scene at his house, he knew he had to act quickly. Quico was safe at Wilson's shelter, under police protection. The parrot had been unusually calm when Pablo left him, as if he knew they were finally close to revealing the truth. When Pablo reached the bank teller, he presented his documentation. The police had helped him obtain emergency access to Montgomery's safety deposit box. The evidence of a break-in and attempted harm related to the box had convinced a judge to grant the order. The bank manager led Pablo to the vault. As they walked, Pablo could feel eyes on him. He knew he wasn't being paranoid. After last night's events, he was sure someone was watching, but inside the bank, surrounded by cameras and security, they wouldn't dare try anything. The box number matched the sequence hidden in the musical notes. Pablo's hands trembled slightly as he inserted the key. Inside, he found an envelope and a small recording device. "Would you like some privacy, sir?" the manager asked. Pablo nodded, and the manager left him alone in the viewing room. He opened the envelope first. Inside were photographs, clear, detailed images showing a group of men in a warehouse. They were handling crates filled with what looked like antique artifacts. Pablo recognized one of the men from old newspaper photos, a prominent business owner who had died recently. The recording device contained a single audio file. Pablo pressed play, and Montgomery's voice filled the small room. "If anyone is hearing this, something has happened to me. These photographs prove that Marcus Wheeler and his partners have been trafficking stolen artifacts through their shipping company. They've been replacing priceless historical items with forgeries, selling the originals on the black market. I have documentation proving the scope of their operation, but they discovered I was investigating them. I've hidden the complete evidence in a second location. The key to finding it is with my most trusted friend, the one who sees everything but speaks only truth." Pablo's breath caught. Quico. Montgomery had trusted his most damaging evidence to his parrot, knowing that only the right person would be able to understand the bird's clues. Suddenly, the door opened. Pablo turned, expecting the bank manager. Instead, he found himself face to face with an elegant older woman. "Hello, Pablo," she said softly. "I'm Regina Wheeler, Marcus's widow. We need to talk." Part 7. The Final Piece. Regina Wheeler carried herself with the confidence of someone used to power, but there was something else in her expression, weariness, and perhaps regret. "I've been watching you," she said, sitting down across from Pablo. "Ever since you adopted that parrot, I knew this day would come." "Did you know?" Pablo asked. "So about what your husband was doing?" Regina's face hardened. "I discovered the truth shortly before his death. The guilt consumed him in his final days. He was going to confess everything, return the artifacts, make it right. But someone in his organization found out. They killed him," Pablo realized. "Just like they killed Montgomery." Regina nodded. Montgomery had nearly exposed everything. After his death, they thought they were safe, but that parrot, she smiled slightly. Elias was clever, training Quico to remember specific phrases, to respond to certain triggers. He knew the bird would eventually find someone worthy of trust. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to finish what my husband couldn't," Regina said, reaching into her bag. She removed a thick file. "This is everything. Documentation of every stolen artifact, every forged piece, every transaction. Marcus kept it as insurance. I've been waiting for the right moment, the right person." Pablo looked at the file, then back at Regina. "The men who broke into my house. Working for Marcus's former partner, he suspects I have this evidence. After seeing your connection to Montgomery's parrot in the news, he's desperate to silence anyone who might expose the truth." Pablo took the file with trembling hands. Combined with Montgomery's photographs and recording, it was everything needed to expose the operation and bring justice to both Montgomery and Marcus Wheeler's deaths. Later that day, Pablo sat in his living room, Quico back on his perch beside him. The police had everything now. Regina's files, Montgomery's evidence, all of it. Arrests were already being made. "You knew," Pablo said softly to Quico. "You were waiting for someone you could trust, someone who would listen and understand." Quico turned his head, focusing his good eye on Pablo. "Friend," he said, but this time added something new. "Family." Pablo felt tears in his eyes. Through all of this, the mystery, the danger, the revelations, something remarkable had happened. He and this damaged, extraordinary bird had formed a bond that went beyond mere friendship. They had healed each other's loneliness, given each other purpose. "That's right," Pablo whispered. "We're family now." Months passed. The investigation led to numerous arrests and the recovery of many stolen artifacts. Regina Wheeler kept her word, testifying against everyone involved. Montgomery's name was cleared, his reputation as a dedicated investigator restored. Pablo and Quico settled into a peaceful routine. The parrot still whistled his special lullaby sometimes, but now it felt less like a secret code, and more like a celebration of mysteries solved and truths revealed. Quico's feathers began to grow back properly under Pablo's careful attention. While his injuries would never fully heal, he seemed more vibrant, more alive. He spoke more often, not just to Pablo but to visitors as well, though he still reserved his most meaningful communications for quiet moments with his chosen family. One evening, as Pablo read in his favorite chair, Quico surprised him with a new phrase, "Happy now." Pablo looked up at his extraordinary friend, this brave creature who had carried such important secrets for so long, waiting for the right person to help him reveal them. "Yes," Pablo replied, reaching out to gently stroke Quico's head. "We both are." The parrot leaned into his touch, and in that moment, Pablo knew that sometimes the most profound connections come in unexpected forms. He had gone to the shelter looking for a pet, and found instead a partner in solving a mystery, a keeper of secrets, and most importantly, a true friend. Outside, the sun set on another peaceful day, its golden light filling the room where man and parrot had found not just justice, but something far more precious, a home in each other's hearts. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.